Okay, hi everyone. Thank you for coming to my session this afternoon, the 1B workshop on good practices of National Federation safeguarding officers. Uh, I know that Andy introduced me before, so I'll thank him for that introduction. But briefly, I am Dr. Kacey Neely, and I am the Director of Safe Sport at Gymnastics Canada. Uh, Prior to starting my role with Gymnastics Canada, I was an academic, and so when they asked me to present on best practices, the researcher in me was very much, I'm going to call it good practices, because we don't actually have research or evidence to say that these are the best practices, but they are what's working well for safeguarding officers right now. And as Safe Sport advances and we do more research, I hope in a few years that we can say that these are best practices. So just a quick outline of the workshop today. We'll first start by talking about what safeguarding is and define safe sport. Then we'll talk about the role of a safeguarding officer and what that could look like in your national federation. Then we'll talk about some of the potential challenges of a safeguarding officer and what individuals in the role may face. And then we'll also have a discussion on what some of these good practices are. And then finally, I'd like to share some of my own experience and my current learnings as the Director of Safe Sport. And then if there is time, I'm happy to answer some questions at the end. So I would like to start just by getting an understanding of who's in the room today, who's the audience. So if you want to pull out your phone and go to slido.com, we'll start there. And so once you're there, you can join at 3108801. And so the first question that I have for everyone is, do you have a safeguarding or safe sport officer or someone in a safe sport role within your federation? And I know we're all at different points on the safe sport journey, so there is no right answer here. It's good to see it's working. Again, the number is 3108801. Have most people completed it? All right, well, it looks like we have a good number of federations that do have someone in a safe sport role, so that's great. And for those who don't yet, I hope that you find that you do soon, but you also find today's workshop useful in getting you to that next step of having a safeguarding officer. Okay, so the second question is how many of you are actually in a safeguarding role within your national federation? The number's growing. Okay, so if we stop there, about a third of you are in a safeguarding role. So I hope you agree with what I talk about as some of the challenges are and some of the good practices. But I also hope that you speak up and can contribute to our discussions on what these challenges and good practices are. Because I think one of the best ways to learn is from each other. Okay, so we'll take a quick step back and really look at what is safe sport. And as Teen said this morning, you know, there isn't a worldwide unified definition on safe sport. And so that is one of the challenges, is that we have a general understanding of safe sport and safeguarding, but there isn't one single definition as to what it is. And so, for example, the IOC defines safe sport as an athletic environment that is respectful, equitable, and free from all forms of non-accidental violence to athletes. They also state in their IOC toolkit that they describe safe sport as a safeguarding from harassment and abuse. The CAC is the Coaching Association of Canada, and they have a bit broader of a definition. So they state that safe sport is a collective responsibility of all stakeholders to create, foster, and preserve sport environments that ensure positive, healthy, and fulfilling experiences for all individuals, and to recognize and report acts of maltreatment and prioritize the welfare, safety, and rights of every person involved. And so safeguarding, if we look at safe sport as the environment that we create, safeguarding is the actual act of protecting athletes from harassment and abuse. At Gymnastics Canada, we have a slightly different definition of safe sport, and so we operate under the definition that safe sport is the process and measures implemented to protect and effectively care for the health, well-being, and human rights of all participants in the Gymnastics Canada community, especially children and youth. And so what all of these various definitions do have in common is that they highlight the focus on prevention from harm and protection of rights. They focus on the population of interest, and that can range from solely looking at athletes to all the way protecting everyone who's involved in the sport community. And then that it occurs in a safe environment. And as we advance safe sport globally, it will be important to develop a generally accepted universal definition, as well as a framework for understanding and implementing safe sport. So now we're going to do a little game of true and false, just to kind of recognize the importance of safe sport, which you're all here, so you know it's important, but also why we need someone in a safeguarding officer role. So I'll read a statement, and then if you think it's true, put your hand up, and then take it down, and then if it's false, we'll go from there. So harassment and abuse do not occur in my sport. True? False. Put your hand up if you think it's false. Yeah. All right. So you're all correct. It is false. The small research that we do have on safe sport does show that harassment and abuse occurs in all sports, and we do know that it's happening across all disciplines in gymnastics. Harassment and abuse in sport only occur in certain countries. Anyone think that's true? Anyone think that's false? All right, we have a bright audience today. Yeah, so a number of studies have demonstrated that harassment and abuse occur in sport worldwide. No country or continent is free from abuse in sport. Okay, if we have never had a reported case of harassment or abuse, the issue doesn't concern us. True? False. All right, you're all correct again. So not having reported cases of harassment and abuse does not mean that harassment and abuse are not occurring. If effective safe sport policies are not in place, often cases of maltreatment are not reported, they're not investigated, and as we know, athletes can also be quite hesitant to report cases of maltreatment. Okay, harassment and abuse is not a problem for elite athletes. True? False. Correct. So studies have also demonstrated that elite athletes actually have an increased risk of experiencing abuse and harassment in sport, but it is still important to recognize that abuse and harassment occur at all levels of sport. Finally, athlete safeguarding should concern everyone working in sport. True? False. Okay. And there you go. Yeah. Everyone involved in an organized sport shares the responsibility to adhere to the principles of safe sport and the implementation and adherence of safeguarding policies. So why the need for safeguarding officers? I think we all know that we're at a critical point in sport where it's just needed. We're all well aware of the high-profile cases that have occurred in sport, as well as specifically have occurred in gymnastics, as well as the media attention that gymnastics is receiving worldwide. Athletes are using their voice and speaking up, bringing to light historic cases, but unfortunately instances of abuse are still occurring, as the demand for perfection and a winning at all cost attitude persists in our sport. So sport organizations and everyone in sport really does have the responsibility to foster safe, respectful cultures so that athletes can thrive without experience harassment and abuse. And all sport organizations must implement measures to prevent and respond to incidences of harassment and abuse. And the effectiveness of these measures really depends on having someone in that role to implement them and monitor them. There's also going to be requirements for national federations to have procedures and policies. A good example is FIG leading the way in that they're going to require every national federation to be responsible for developing and implementing policy and procedures for safeguarding and protecting participants. National federations are going to be responsible for fostering those policies or ensuring those policies and procedures are in line with the standards of FIG policies and procedures. They'll be responsible to ensure that all participants in gymnastics are aware of these procedures. And then also advising FIG if any disciplinary sanctions are imposed, particularly at FIG events. And in the IOC's consensus statement on harassment and abuse in sport, it was stated that it's incumbent upon all stakeholders in sport both to adopt general principles for safe sport and to implement and monitor policies and procedures for safe sport, which state that all athletes have a right to be treated with respect and protected from non-accidental violence. So it really is one thing for us to sit here and say that safe sport is a priority, but it's another thing to act on it. And one way to demonstrate that it really is a priority for national federations worldwide is to have someone whose sole responsibility in the federation is safe sport and safeguarding. Okay, so if you want to pull out your phones again, and the next kind of activity for Slido is, what does or should safeguarding or safe sport include? So I think there's an interpretation that it's just to deal with maltreatment and abuse and harassment in sport. But if we look at safe sport, what else could it potentially include? So if you put that number in, or scan the barcode, I didn't even realize that was there, you can enter multiple words, just one word at a time, and we will see our word garden grow. Another way to think about it is, if we call it safe sport, what would safe sport include? Or sport safety, sorry. So we'll give about 20 more seconds and we'll see what we come up with. So I do like that education, prevention, and support are kind of the three key areas that we've come up with. We got a few more coming. Okay. So I think that safe sport includes a lot of aspects. I think the focus has been on prevention and responding to safe sport complaints. But there's other areas of safe sport that I think if you're in a safeguarding officer position that you may want to also consider. So there's also the physical safety and injury prevention. So things like, is the equipment up to date? Is it safe to be using that equipment? Concussion, and do you have concussion policies and return to sport policies? Someone had said psychological support, so I think mental health and well-being is another huge aspect that falls under safe sport and safeguarding. Obviously, policy and procedures. It's important that there's a complaint process in place and that case management is also part of that role. In some cases, your anti-doping policies and guidelines around anti-doping would fall under safe sport to help maintain the integrity of sport. Ethics and integrity as well, and one that it's not up there, but your equity, diversity, and inclusion, that area can also be considered an aspect of safe sport. So the overall role of the safeguarding officer may vary slightly in national federations, depending on how you describe the role, but it's likely going to oversee three core aspects, and that's policy, education, and advocacy. So in terms of policy, it's developing, communicating, and implementing policy and procedures. Education, we know, is a huge one, and so that's enhancing the knowledge and understanding of safe sport topics. So as we just talked about different aspects of safe sport, there are multiple topics that those involved in sport, athletes, coaches, parents, administrators, other key stakeholders, judges, should be made aware of and educated on. And then advocacy, creating awareness and actively promoting safe sport principles. And I know that one of the talks later is on kind of safe sport campaigns, so that would fall under the advocacy pillar. And so I think a big task when starting in a safeguarding role or establishing safe sport within your national federation is actually developing a safe sport framework and a strategy to implement that framework. And so currently there is no single universal safe sport framework. I know researchers are looking to develop one, but as it stands, there isn't one. So it's up to national federations to develop their own framework. And so an example within Gymnastics Canada is our framework falls under these three core pillars of policy, education, and advocacy. And then through these three pillars are reflected in our four main topic areas. And so one is abuse prevention and response. So preventing harm, identifying potential misconduct, and building confidence to act and report misconduct. It also includes complaint handling and discipline, and supporting and advancing positive practices in all gymnastics environments. Risk management is another one of our topic areas. So proactive measures to facilitate and support the safe sport program, including recruitment, screening, and orientation. Health and wellness, so supporting and enhancing the physical, psychological, emotional, and social welfare of all individuals in the gymnastics community. Athletes have always been the priority, but I think it's important that we recognize that we also have a job to protect the well-being of coaches, judges, parents, and other key stakeholders. And then finally, equity and inclusion. So promoting fair treatment and purposeful inclusion of all participants, regardless of age, race, color, gender identity, sexual orientation, language, religion, and so forth. Well, thank you everyone for having that discussion and sharing some of the challenges that you've personally experienced within your federation. So by no means is this an exhaustive list. And I think some we have touched on. So often resources can be a big challenge to having someone in a safeguarding or safe sport role. And that's resources in terms of person power. So like this group said, you know, it's a lot for one individual to take on, and I can vouch for that as the only person at GymCan who solely works on safe sport. But also financial resources. Not that I have solutions to all of these challenges, but I think sometimes it's about getting creative. And in smaller nations, it may be that there's a safeguarding officer who works across multiple sports. Ideally, if they're developing policies and procedures, they can be applied in multiple sport domains. And so maybe that's one way to deal with the financial cost of having someone in that role. They work for 3 or 4 national sport federations. I think you spoke to this, finding the right person. I think just for any position, it's about finding the right person, and they need to be a good fit. I wouldn't say there are any best practices in terms of what you need to look for in that individual, but like bottom line, it needs to be someone who's completely committed to it. And so working out what's going to work best for your federation. Training, when you onboard or high turnover, does that person have like the background knowledge to fulfill the role? I know I come from a sports psych background, so I view things one way, but I've started the IOC Safeguarding Officer in Sport program, and I think that is a beneficial program and quite valuable for anyone who's entering into a safe sport role. I think one of the challenges, and this may resonate with a lot of people, is working in silos. So you come into a safe sport role and everyone else in the federation is kind of like, oh, well, that's safe sport. And so they don't kind of want to get their hands involved in that. So that can be a potential challenge. Confidentiality and having that trusted person that athletes or other members of the gymnastics community can come speak to. Historically, I think there's been a lack of trust and fear of consequences of reporting incidences. So it's really important that we build that trust, but that will probably always be a bit of a challenge for safe sport individuals. And then safe sport being viewed as a checkbox activity. I think that speaks to the challenge of really getting everyone on board that this is a priority, and it's more than just, okay, we have policies in place, we're good for safe sport, because we know that that's not the extent of safe sport, and having a policy doesn't mean that safe sport is going to be implemented. All right, so good practices. I think, like I said, we haven't done the research to know that these are best practices, and the area of safe sport is relatively new and it is emerging, but as it advances, I think we'll be able to with evidence and confidence, say that there are best practices. So I think first and foremost, having a dedicated safe sport person, and if you have the resources in your federation, having a team. I know GymCan is fortunate that we do have resources, but compared to other national sport organizations in Canada, for example, Hockey Canada has a team of 8 people. And so they have a director specifically for maltreatment. They have a director specifically for equity and diversity. So with more people, you can handle more, but I think first and foremost, it's getting one person in that role to start leading the way. One of the, I think, best practices in establishing that role and the priority of safe sport is integration within your national federation. So I think defining what the safe sport individual's role really is, but then really working with other members of the federation to see how important and how collaborative safe sport needs to be. So connecting with, if you have a manager of coach education or a manager of high performance, seeing how they're so correlated, and really establishing that team approach to handling safe sport. And I think with that is building relationships, not only within your sport organization, but also other sport organizations across your nation. Some may have established safeguarding policies and roles, and you can learn so much from them. It was mentioned earlier, borrow, beg, steal the policies and procedures that they already have in place, and then modify them to best fit your organization and make them specific to gymnastics. I also think engaging with stakeholders externally. And so what I mean by this is connecting with other organizations. So maybe there's Child Protective Services. In Canada, we have the Canadian Centre for Mental Health in Sport. And so we've connected with CCMHS to provide support for athletes and coaches who have put forth a complaint. It's completely anonymous, and they know that that support is there for them if they need it. And then the last group spoke to this as a challenge about having someone to talk to, or because it's so demanding on the individual in that role, it's really important that you have a mentor or a friend or a colleague that, and actually I'm hesitant to say colleague because of the confidentiality and nature of safe sport, but having someone you can go to. I'm fortunate that I do have a number of people that I could go to. but even having a counselor, because you do hear a lot of horrific stories when athletes are courageous enough to speak up, and that takes a lot on you as an individual to hear that and respond, but you need an outlet too, because you need that support as well. I think reading research is really important. We know that there's not that much research out there, but as that area of research continues to grow, it's really important to stay up to date on that so that your practices within safe sport are evidence informed. That is one avenue where a lot of athletes do speak up because it seems unrelated and not directly related to their sport. So you hear athletes' voices through that research. And then in terms of more of the policy and procedure sides of things, I'm not going to speak about developing your policy and procedures. I think a great resource is, again, that IOC toolkit. It has separate chapters that speaks or walks you through developing your guidelines or your policies and procedures that you want to develop. But one of the things is that it's clear language, having athletes involved in that process, having coaches involved in that process. So it's almost a collaborative effort to develop policies and procedures. I think the last group talked about this, but having a good reporting mechanism for athletes that's safe and confidential, but also an independent third party, so those conflict of interests are avoided as much as possible. I think screening of all your participants in your sport is really important. So when I joined GymCan, it's now mandatory that all volunteers, not only are they screened and back-checked in a vulnerable persons check, but part of their screening is that we check that they've completed the Coaching Association of Canada's Safe Sport Training module. And so that's just a requirement, bare minimum requirement, that we know people at least have an understanding of safe sport and the idea that see something, say something. Again, on policy, in Canada, so we have multiple provinces, and each province is their own jurisdiction. So as much as possible, we're trying to align our policies so that they're the same, and safe sport guidelines, policies, and procedures are consistent across the country. And then good practices in terms of education. Like you said, there's so many different areas of education that we could, and topics we could talk about. It's not just educating coaches, who in the past have been seen as kind of the monsters, but it's about educating your entire federation staff, athletes and coaches, and then including parents so they have a better understanding. And with this education, bringing in experts, so bringing in psychologists, maybe bringing in someone who's an expert in trauma-informed processes to make sure that you're doing things in a safe and appropriate way. So just some other resources and a few other considerations for safeguarding officers. Like I said, I think the IOC Safeguarding Officer in Sport is a really valuable course to engage in. Safe Sport International is a agency that provides education, consulting, and so reach out to them. They'll help you with develop your policies. They can provide webinars for different stakeholders in your federation. As well as the International Safeguarding Children in Sport. They have guidelines that are developed to specifically assist sport organizations. It's been mentioned a few times today, but reach out to other gymnastics federations, other sport organizations. We don't need to reinvent the wheel on a lot of this stuff. So it's about taking what's already there, adapting it, and then constantly reviewing it and improving it. And then for any nations that are thinking about hiring or starting someone in this role, an organization in Canada, CIRC, it's the Sport Information Research Council. A few months ago, they actually released an article about the need for safeguarding officers and provided multiple examples of what that job advertisement might look like. So I'm happy, if anyone wants to email me, I'm happy to share that link with you. And I'll leave my email up on the screen in a second. And then just some of my own experiences and what I'm learning in the role. I've been here for 6 months. So in some regards, I'm on the beginning of my journey in safe sport. I think one of the things that we can probably agree on is that it's demanding. There's a lot to cover as one individual covering all of this. It's a lot, but it's worth it. And I think that's the message I would want to share, is that it really is worth it. Connecting with the safe sport community has been one of the highlights for me over the past 6 months. Being here at this conference or this symposium, being able to share good things, bad things, just general experiences in safe sport with people in this community has been a blessing, really. And so that's the networking too. And I've been fortunate to attend things like Gymnastrata, different national competitions, and of course Worlds, and meeting with national federations and the individuals working in safe sport. And then my last, I guess, bit is just on those really tough days when you're stressed and you're overwhelmed by everything you have to do, I think if you can take a step back and just remember your why. Why did you choose to take on this role? Why do you care about this so much? And so when you take that step back, remember your why, you're almost refreshed about going back to work the next day to keep making the change that you want to see in our sport.